The day started like any other, with the sunlight spilling over the small city streets and bouncing off the clean tiles of the cafe where she worked. She moved through the tables with quiet efficiency, wiping crumbs from the wooden surfaces and straightening chairs, her mind elsewhere. Her hands worked automatically, but her thoughts wandered, often drifting to the small notebook she kept tucked in her bag, filled with scribbled musical notes and half-written lyrics. The notebook was her secret, a place where she could escape from the world that had already decided her place. Most people who knew her at work saw only what she did during the day. They saw the mop in her hand, the bucket of soapy water, and the careful way she polished the counter until it shined. They saw her bending over to reach the corners, tying her hair back to keep it out of the way. They didn't see the imagination behind her eyes or hear the tunes she hummed quietly to herself as she cleaned. That humming was something she had done since she was a child, a melody that started in her head and spilled out softly when no one was listening. Her co-workers often teased her gently, not realizing how sharp their words could feel. "Why bother with that singing stuff? Stick to cleaning. It's what you're good at," one of them would say, tossing a casual glance as they moved past. The words were meant to be harmless, a joke, but they cut deeper than they realized. Every time she heard it, a part of her wanted to nod and agree, to fold herself into the role everyone expected her to play. But another part, the larger part, the part that couldn't be silenced, wanted to prove them wrong, wanted to let the music inside her breathe. The cafe itself was modest, the kind of place people came for coffee and a quick sandwich. The customers didn't pay much attention to her. They rarely looked past the apron she wore or the towel she carried. Some smiled politely, some nodded when she greeted them, but most were in their own world. She didn't mind. It allowed her to keep her own world alive. As she moved from table to table, wiping crumbs and refilling glasses, she let her fingers tap out little rhythms on the counters, tiny beats that made her heart lift. She imagined a piano under her fingertips, imagined the soft swell of notes, the rise and fall of melody. In her small apartment later, after the cafe had closed for the day and the streets had quieted, she allowed herself the freedom she craved. She sat by the window, the city lights twinkling below, and pulled her notebook out. She hummed softly, letting the tune rise and fall until it found a shape, and then she wrote it down. It was slow work, careful and deliberate, but every mark on the page was a piece of her soul, something the world hadn't seen yet. Sometimes the melody surprised her, taking a turn she hadn't planned. Other times it felt familiar, comforting, like an old friend. Her neighbors often heard the faint strains of her humming through the thin walls. They might have thought it was a radio or a song on the phone, but it was just her, alone with her dreams. The piano she didn't have in her apartment existed in her mind, the keys under her fingers, the notes spilling out, untouchable yet real. It was in those quiet moments that she felt alive, that she felt herself fully, not just the person who cleaned tables or scrubbed floors. Here, she could imagine a life where her voice mattered, where her tunes could make someone smile, where she could touch people without even speaking. But reality was never far away. Bills piled on the kitchen counter, the rent needed to be paid, and there were days when she returned to the cafe feeling too tired to even lift her head. On those days, the teasing comments of coworkers felt like bricks pressing down, heavy and unrelenting. She would bend over her cleaning, her hands moving automatically, but inside, the melody refused to leave her. It hummed and twisted, growing louder in the silence, as if reminding her that she was more than the job she did. She remembered a moment from her childhood, standing in a crowded kitchen while her mother cooked, tapping her fingers on the table in time with the radio. She had been small, clumsy, but full of energy, and she remembered the way a simple song could make her heart leap. That feeling had never left her. Even as the years added responsibilities, and the world whispered that dreams like hers were luxuries, she carried it with her, hidden beneath her apron, tucked into her bag, alive in the notes she wrote and the soft hums she let escape when she thought no one was listening. One afternoon, a new customer entered the cafe. He was different from the usual crowd, more attentive, with a quiet curiosity that made her pause for a moment. As she served his coffee and wiped the table nearby, She hummed a little tune, letting it float in the air without thinking. To her surprise, he smiled, a small but genuine smile, and commented, "You have a nice tune there. Do you play?" She froze, caught off guard. Usually, her music went unnoticed, lost in the background, but here was someone who had heard it, who had noticed. She mumbled a quiet, embarrassed answer, something like, "A little," and quickly returned to her cleaning, pretending it had never happened. But the moment lingered in her mind. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, even if only for a few seconds. She wondered what would happen if she allowed herself to try, if she stopped hiding behind the apron and the mop. The thought was frightening. What if she failed? What if the teasing words were right? But another thought was stronger, louder. What if she didn't try? What if she let her life slip by without ever knowing what she could become? Days passed, and she began to notice small changes in herself. She hummed more openly, tapped rhythms on the counter with a little more confidence, and even carried her notebook around with a quiet pride. She was still the same person who cleaned tables and scrubbed floors, but there was something different in the way she moved, in the way her eyes brightened when a melody found her. She began to understand that her passion wasn't a distraction from life. It was the very thing that made life bearable, that made the long hours meaningful. She thought often about the people who had doubted her, the voices that had told her to stick to cleaning. She didn't hate them exactly. She understood that most people fear what they don't understand, and her music was something unusual, something that didn't fit neatly into their world. But she felt a quiet determination growing inside her, a resolve to show them, and herself, that a person is never defined solely by the work they do. Talent, passion, and heart can live in the most unexpected places. One evening, as she returned home from another long day, she sat by the window with her notebook and allowed herself to play a tune on the imaginary piano in her mind. The melody was hesitant at first, like a small bird testing its wings, but it grew bolder, stronger, more sure. She felt her heart lift, a warmth spreading through her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she could make her dreams real. She didn't know what the future held, or how people would react when they finally heard her music, but she knew that the first step was to believe in herself, to let her voice exist, even if the world wasn't ready to listen yet. Night fell, and the city outside her window was quiet. She closed her eyes and hummed softly, letting the tune carry her into a small, gentle world of her own making. It was a world where she wasn't just the cleaner, the background figure in other people's lives. Here she was a musician, a dreamer, a creator. And though the world might tell her to stop, to stick to what she was good at, she knew one thing clearly. The music inside her would not be silenced. Not now, not ever. She had never played in front of anyone before. Even the small moment when the customer at the cafe had smiled at her tune felt like a shock, a glimpse of a world she hadn't allowed herself to step into. That evening, after cleaning her small apartment and preparing a simple dinner, she sat at the tiny table by the window and opened her notebook. She wanted to try again, to see if she could make the music feel as alive outside her mind as it did in it. The first few notes were hesitant, shaky even, but soon her fingers moved more freely, finding a rhythm that made her heart beat faster. Her tunes were still rough, not polished like the songs she heard on the radio, but there was something raw and beautiful about them. She hummed along, letting the melodies form naturally, twisting and turning in ways that surprised her. She realized that she didn't need fancy equipment or a piano to make music. Her imagination could fill the gaps. Every day after work, she began dedicating more time to these sessions, losing herself in the music while the city lights flickered outside her window. One evening, she heard about a small community event in the neighborhood. It was informal, just a gathering where people could showcase their talents, singing, poetry, or playing instruments. Her heart jumped at the thought. This could be the chance she had been waiting for, the chance to step out from behind the mop and apron and let someone hear what she could do. But the thought also terrified her. What if she wasn't ready? What if the tunes she loved so much sounded amateurish to others? She spent several nights practicing, writing new melodies in her notebook and humming them aloud until they became second nature. She imagined herself standing on the small stage, The room quiet, eyes on her, and her heart raced both with excitement and fear. The support she longed for was missing. Her coworkers would probably laugh, her family might shrug, but she kept going. She reminded herself that this was her moment, even if no one else noticed yet. The day of the community event arrived, and she carried her notebook tucked under her arm like a precious treasure. She wore her usual work clothes, simple and practical, but inside she felt different, as if the music itself gave her courage. As she waited backstage, she listened to the other performers. A young singer with a guitar, a poet reciting verses, a child playing the violin. Each one had a small audience, a few encouraging faces clapping and smiling. She felt a pang of doubt. Could she really fit in here? Was her music good enough? When it was her turn, she stepped forward cautiously, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her notebook. She cleared her throat, looked at the small audience, and began. At first, the tune came out softly, almost shyly, but as she continued, it grew stronger, more confident. The notes rose and fell, carrying a sense of hope, struggle, and determination all at once. She felt the rhythm in her chest, felt it in her fingers, and allowed herself to lose fear in the music. The audience was quiet at first, listening closely. She could see a few smiles forming, a head nodding here and there, but mostly they watched in silence. When she finished, there was a moment of stillness, and then a round of applause broke out. It wasn't a huge crowd, but the sound felt enormous to her. She could hardly believe it. People had actually heard her, had listened, and had responded with warmth. She blushed, feeling a mix of pride and relief that she had finally shared a piece of herself with the world. After the performance, a few people came up to speak with her. One older woman complimented the emotion in her playing, saying it reminded her of a simpler time in her own youth. A young man said he liked the unusual twists in her tune, how it didn't follow the patterns he expected. Each comment lifted her spirits, reinforcing that her music had value, that it could touch people even without polish or fame. She realized that this was only the beginning, a first step into a world she had dreamed about for so long. She returned home that evening with a sense of possibility she had never known before. The music in her notebook seemed alive in a new way, ready to grow and expand. She began to experiment with her melodies more freely, letting them flow in directions she hadn't tried before. She hummed as she cleaned, tapped rhythms on the counter, and wrote down ideas that came to her in moments of quiet. Her confidence grew slowly, a gentle but steady flame that refused to be extinguished. Work at the cafe continued as usual, but she saw it differently now. The apron and mop were not limits. They were simply part of her day, part of the rhythm of life that allowed her to return to the music she loved. Sometimes, while cleaning, she would hum the tune she had played at the community event, imagining how it might sound on a real piano, how it might feel to have people really listen. Each day brought new inspiration, new ideas, and the knowledge that she had already taken the first step toward something bigger. She began to notice small changes in the way people looked at her. Some co-workers seemed surprised when she hummed a tune without embarrassment. One or two asked questions, curious about what she had played, though they didn't fully understand her passion. She didn't mind. Her focus was no longer on proving them wrong. It was on proving to herself that she could create, that her music mattered. Her nights were filled with new melodies. She would sit by the window, letting the city lights shine on her notebook, letting her imagination guide her fingers. Sometimes she would close her eyes and picture herself performing for larger audiences, feeling the warmth of connection through music. She learned that the more she allowed herself to dream, the more her melodies grew, not just in complexity but in heart. Each note carried a piece of her story, her struggle, and her hope. Despite the excitement, there were challenges. She had no piano at home, no formal lessons, and no professional guidance. She made do with what she had, improvising on imaginary instruments, using online tutorials, and practicing by ear. Mistakes were frequent, and frustration was common, but she learned to see each error as a lesson, a step toward improvement. The resilience she developed in her daily work carried over to her music, giving her patience and determination. Slowly, She began to dream of more than just small community events. She imagined recording her music, sharing it online, or even performing for larger audiences. These dreams no longer felt impossible. She realized that her talent had always been there, waiting for a moment to emerge, and that moment had arrived. She carried the music with her, not just as a hobby but as a part of who she was, something worth nurturing and protecting. The customer who had complimented her tune at the cafe became a small source of encouragement. He sometimes asked how her music was going, and though the conversations were brief, they reminded her that someone out there believed in her talent. That small recognition fueled her confidence, helping her to imagine a future where music could play a central role in her life, not just a quiet escape. Every day, as she moved through her routine at work, she noticed how the music had changed her perspective. Cleaning tables, washing dishes, and mopping floors no longer felt like obstacles. They were part of the rhythm of her life, giving structure to her days and a reason to return each evening to the melodies she created. She realized that talent and passion could coexist with ordinary life, that dreams didn't have to be put aside while paying bills or fulfilling responsibilities. Even on the hardest days, when fatigue weighed heavily and doubts crept in, she clung to the music. It became a constant companion, a source of comfort and inspiration. She hummed through her routines, tapping out rhythms with her fingers, and filled her small apartment with imaginary performances that kept her spirit alive. She learned that the music wasn't just about skill or recognition. It was about expression, about giving voice to her feelings and experiences, and sharing a piece of herself with the world, even if only in small ways. Through this journey, she discovered something vital. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it is a quiet voice at the end of the day saying, "I will try again tomorrow." She realized that every note she played, every melody she wrote, was an act of courage. The world might still doubt her, but she no longer needed their approval. Her music belonged to her, and it was enough that it existed, that it spoke her truth, and that it had the power to touch hearts, even in the smallest of moments. The experience of performing at the community event and the subsequent nights of practice transformed her. She understood that music was no longer a secret. It was part of her identity. She walked through her daily life with a quiet confidence, carrying her melodies in her mind, ready for the next opportunity, the next audience, the next moment where her music could rise from the shadows and speak out into the world. The excitement from her first performance didn't fade, but life reminded her quickly that passion alone wasn't enough. She returned to her cleaning job the next morning, greeted by the familiar smell of soap and coffee, the clatter of cups, and the soft chatter of customers. She moved through her tasks with the same careful routine, but now there was a quiet glow inside her, a sense that she had stepped into a larger world. The music inside her had grown, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. Yet, the challenges of reality pressed down. Bills, responsibilities, and the lack of tools or formal training threatened to dim her spark. She began to think seriously about how she could improve. Watching videos online, she learned about scales, chords, and rhythm patterns. She practiced slowly, sometimes frustrated when her fingers wouldn't move the way she imagined, or when a melody sounded off. She reminded herself that mastery wasn't instant. Each mistake was a lesson, and each correction built her confidence. She experimented, combining old tunes she remembered with new ideas, slowly creating her own style. There was no teacher to guide her, but her curiosity became her mentor. Her notebook became her world. Pages filled with notes, sketches of musical patterns, lyrics, and ideas for arrangements. She wrote when she felt inspiration, sometimes standing at the sink while washing dishes or tapping her fingers on the cafe counter. The notebook became more than a collection of melodies. It was proof that her music existed, that she had begun to shape a future beyond cleaning tables. She kept it close, hidden from most people, but it was her treasure, her map to a new life. Even her co-workers started noticing a difference in her. She walked with a quiet confidence now, her eyes brighter, her posture taller. Some asked what she had been doing in her free time, curious about the glow that seemed to follow her. She would smile and say little, letting them guess, because she was still cautious. The world hadn't yet fully embraced the idea of a cleaner who could create music, and she knew people might still laugh if they heard her tunes directly. She didn't need validation from them yet. She needed to grow first. Then came a moment that tested her courage. A friend of a friend invited her to a small gathering where musicians often met to jam together. It wasn't a formal stage, but there would be other players, some skilled and experienced. Her heart leapt and sank at the same time. Should she go? Could she compete with people who had years of practice, instruments, and formal training? Fear clawed at her, whispering that she was not ready, that her music was nothing compared to theirs. But something stronger, her growing belief in herself, won out. She agreed to go. The night of the gathering, she arrived carrying her notebook and an old, borrowed keyboard. She sat up in the corner, feeling the nervous energy buzz through the room. Other musicians tuned their instruments, strummed guitars, and shared laughs. She listened first, absorbing the rhythms, the melodies, the confidence in the way they played. It was intimidating, but she reminded herself that she didn't need to impress anyone. She needed to play for herself to test her courage. When it was her turn, she opened her notebook and let the music flow. The first notes were hesitant, quiet, as if testing the air. But soon, she found her rhythm, and the melody rose stronger, filled with the emotion she had bottled up for so long. It wasn't perfect. It stumbled here and there, but it carried honesty and heart. Some listeners nodded, some smiled, and a few whispered words of encouragement. For the first time, she played not just for herself, but in front of people who listened closely, who responded to the music without judgment. Afterward, a few musicians came to her. One older man complimented her ability to improvise. Another said her tunes had feeling, not just notes. The words didn't just praise her. They reminded her that she could belong in this world, that talent could emerge from anywhere. She realized that the world of music wasn't limited to those with formal education or famous names. It was open to anyone who dared to create and to share. Returning home that night, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. She lay on her bed, notebook on her chest, and replayed the moments in her mind. Each note she had played, each smile she had received, added to her courage. She realized that obstacles were not reasons to stop. They were reasons to grow stronger. She didn't have a piano at home or years of training, but she had determination, heart, and imagination. That was enough to begin her journey. Days turned into weeks and she established a routine. After work, she would sit by the window with her notebook and keyboard, experimenting with melodies. Sometimes she recorded herself on her phone to listen and improve. Sometimes she played just for the joy of hearing the tunes come alive. Each day brought new discoveries. A chord progression she hadn't tried before, a rhythm that surprised her, a combination of notes that made her laugh with delight. The music was no longer just a dream. It was a tangible, growing part of her life. She also started imagining ways to share her music beyond small gatherings. What if she posted a video online? What if she performed at a bigger event? The thoughts were both thrilling and frightening. Failure still lingered at the edges of her mind, but she pushed it aside, reminding herself that every great musician had faced doubt and obstacles. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was moving forward despite it. Her confidence in public performance grew slowly. She learned to trust her instincts, to follow the flow of a melody, even when it led her into unexpected places. Sometimes she made mistakes, hitting a wrong note or losing rhythm, but she learned to smile and continue. The audience, whether small or large, responded to the honesty of her music, not its perfection. She realized that expressing herself fully mattered more than technical flawlessness. At the cafe, she carried this new confidence into her daily life. Cleaning, serving, and moving through routines became easier, not because the work changed, but because her perception of herself changed. She was no longer just the cleaner. She was a musician, a dreamer, someone capable of creating beauty in the midst of ordinary life. This understanding gave her strength and a quiet joy that no one could take away. She began to notice little things. A tune that hummed in her head while mopping the floor, a rhythm in the clatter of dishes, the inspiration of a stranger's smile. Everyday moments became sources of melody, small sparks that fueled her creativity. Her music was no longer confined to notebook pages. It flowed through her life, shaping her world and her thoughts. She began to see the connection between her daily work and her passion. Both required patience, attention, and dedication, and both could bring fulfillment in their own ways. Financial struggles were still present, but she found ways to adapt. She borrowed a small keyboard from a friend for practice, used free online resources to learn theory, and saved every spare penny to improve her setup. She learned that persistence and creativity could overcome many limitations. Even when things were difficult, her music provided solace and motivation, reminding her that she was building something meaningful with every note she played. Her family and friends began noticing the change in her as well. While some were skeptical at first, most could see her growing confidence and joy. They began asking about her music, curious about the notebooks and recordings she carried. She shared cautiously, showing them a few tunes, explaining her ideas, and letting the melodies speak for themselves. The response wasn't always overwhelming praise, but it was enough to affirm that her music mattered and that she could continue pursuing it without shame. Through it all, she realized that music had become more than a dream. It was a lifeline. It had taught her patience, courage, and the power of self-expression. It reminded her that she could be more than the job she held, that her identity wasn't limited to expectations others placed on her. The melodies that had begun as secret hums while cleaning had grown into something tangible and inspiring, capable of connecting her to others and to herself in a way nothing else could. She also began to see a future that was no longer limited to imagination. She planned to perform more regularly, to experiment with recording, and to share her music online. Each step felt like a small victory, a reaffirmation that she was capable, that she belonged in the world she had dared to imagine. And though the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, she had already proven to herself that she could begin, and that beginning was often the hardest and most important part. Her music became her voice, a declaration of who she was and who she wanted to become. The notes carried her story. The long hours of cleaning, the whispered discouragement of others, the nights spent alone with her notebook, and the moments of courage that brought her onto a stage or in front of other musicians. Each melody was a testament to resilience and hope, a reminder that even ordinary life could hold extraordinary possibilities when courage and passion guided the way. She had learned that true growth required stepping into the unknown, facing fear, and trusting oneself. Her journey was still unfolding, with more challenges and opportunities ahead, but she felt ready. The music inside her was no longer silent. It had begun to echo out into the world, carrying her story, her dreams, and her spirit with every note. Weeks passed, and her music continued to grow in confidence and depth. Each evening, she would return from work, place her small keyboard on the table by the window, and let her fingers move freely over the keys. The melodies she created were richer now, filled with emotion and nuance, reflecting the struggles and triumphs of her daily life. Each note felt like a conversation with herself, a dialogue between the person she had been and the person she was becoming. The community gatherings she had attended had sparked something deeper. She wanted more than small rooms with a few listeners. She wanted her music to reach beyond her apartment, to touch others in ways she hadn't imagined. One evening, she learned about a local talent showcase organized by a community arts center. It wasn't a large event, but it promised a larger audience and a chance to perform in front of people who had never heard her music before. She felt a rush of excitement and fear at the same time. This was her chance to see if her music could resonate outside her small circle. Preparing for the showcase became a mission. After work, she practiced for hours, recording herself on her phone to analyze the sound and adjust the flow of the tune. She refined the melody she had first played at the community gathering, adding layers of rhythm and subtle changes to create more depth. She experimented with timing, making certain parts linger, letting the notes breathe. The process was exhausting, but she felt alive in a way she had never experienced before. The music carried her, lifted her, and gave her a sense of purpose she couldn't ignore. At the cafe, she moved through her duties with a quiet intensity. Cleaning the tables, arranging chairs, and serving drinks became part of her preparation. Every tap of the mop, every swipe of the rag, she imagined as part of the rhythm of her life, a prelude to the music she would soon share. She noticed the small details around her. The clinking of glasses, the laughter of customers, the footsteps across the floor, and found that even these ordinary sounds could inspire melodies. Her music was no longer separate from her life. It was intertwined with everything she experienced. The night of the showcase arrived, and her nerves were taut. She carried her notebook, a small keyboard, and a quiet hope that her music could speak for her. Backstage, she watched other performers warm up, some confident, some jittery, all eager to share their art. She felt a moment of doubt, a fleeting fear that her tunes, which had grown from secret humming while cleaning, might not be enough. But she took a deep breath and reminded herself of how far she had come. This was her moment to step fully into the light. When she walked onto the small stage, the audience's eyes felt heavy on her, but she didn't let it paralyze her. She placed her keyboard on the stand, opened her notebook, and let the first notes flow. The tune began softly, tenderly, like a secret being whispered, and then grew stronger, filled with layers and emotion. She poured every experience she had into the music. The long hours of cleaning, the discouraging words of others, the quiet nights of practice, and the small victories that had fueled her confidence. Her fingers moved with intention and heart, and the melody took on a life of its own. The audience was silent, listening intently. Some leaned forward, curious. Others closed their eyes, allowing themselves to be carried by the music. She felt the energy of the room respond to her, a connection that transcended words. Every note seemed to bridge the distance between her hidden world and the people in front of her. When the melody reached its climax, she felt a surge of pride and release, the culmination of months of effort and courage. As she finished, the room erupted in applause. The sound was overwhelming, yet joyous, a validation she had longed for but hadn't expected to feel so deeply. People came forward, complimenting the originality and emotional power of her music. One woman said the tune reminded her of a story she had lived through. Another commented on the depth of feeling conveyed through the melody. Each response reinforced that her music had the power to move, to reach beyond herself, and to connect with others on a human level. After the showcase, she was approached by a small local studio owner who had attended the performance. He invited her to record a few tracks, encouraging her to capture the raw emotion and creativity she had shared on stage. The idea was thrilling and terrifying. She had never imagined her music reaching beyond live performances, never thought about recording and distributing it. But the invitation felt like recognition, proof that her dedication and courage had tangible rewards. She accepted, her heart full of excitement and nerves. Returning home that night, she felt transformed. Her apartment, usually quiet and small, seemed alive with possibility. She placed her notebook on the table and reviewed her tunes, imagining how they could sound with proper recording equipment, how they could reach people far beyond her neighborhood. The fear that had once haunted her of failure, of not being good enough, began to fade. She realized that courage didn't mean the absence of fear. It meant continuing despite it, allowing the music to lead her forward. The following weeks were filled with preparation for the recording session. She refined her melodies, experimented with harmonies, and even tried small vocal accompaniments to complement her tunes. Each practice session was a mix of trial and error, frustration and discovery, but she embraced it all. The music became a mirror reflecting her growth, resilience, and dedication. She had started as someone who hummed quietly while cleaning, and now she was shaping songs that could carry her story to others. At the studio, she experienced a new world. The equipment was complex, the staff professional but welcoming, and the atmosphere both exciting and intimidating. She placed her hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began. The recording captured more than just notes. It captured the emotion, the journey, and the honesty she had nurtured over months of practice. Listening to playback for the first time, she felt a surge of accomplishment. The music sounded like her. Not perfect, not polished, but authentic and alive. Word of her music began to spread locally. Friends and acquaintances shared clips, listeners praised the raw emotion, and she received small messages of encouragement from people she had never met. Each message felt like a bridge, a connection formed through the vulnerability and honesty of her tunes. She realized that music had a unique power to communicate what words could not, to convey feelings and stories in ways that could touch anyone willing to listen. Her life began to shift in subtle ways. The cafe work remained, but it no longer defined her. She walked with a new sense of purpose, her confidence evident in her posture, her smile, and the quiet energy she carried. Her colleagues noticed a difference, and while not everyone understood her passion, they respected the dedication and joy it brought her. She had learned that pursuing dreams didn't require approval from everyone. It required belief in oneself and the willingness to act. She continued to perform, experiment, and share her music. Each step brought new lessons, from understanding how to connect with an audience to learning how to manage her time between work and practice. She realized that the journey itself was as valuable as the destination, that the growth, courage, and persistence she cultivated were part of the music she created. Her melodies now carried layers of meaning, not just notes, but experiences, emotions, and reflections of her journey. One evening, after another successful recording session, she sat by her window with her notebook and keyboard. She listened to the playback, letting the melodies wash over her, and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had begun as a cleaner who hummed in secret, doubted by others and unsure of herself. Now she was a musician whose tunes had begun to reach others, whose courage had transformed her life, and whose determination promised even greater possibilities. The music was no longer just a dream. It was reality, alive and growing, just like her. The weeks after her first recording session were filled with new energy and purpose. She woke each morning with a spark in her chest, eager to practice, to refine her tunes, and to find new ways to express herself. The small apartment that had once felt quiet and confining now seemed alive with possibilities. Her notebook, once a secret place for melodies, was now filled with ideas, layered arrangements, and reflections of her journey. Music had become not only her passion but also the lens through which she experienced life. Her work at the cafe continued, but it no longer defined her. Cleaning tables, refilling coffee cups, and wiping counters became part of a routine that allowed her to sustain her life and her art. She approached each task with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her music gave her a world beyond the walls of the cafe. She sometimes hummed softly while working, letting rhythms rise from the clatter of dishes and footsteps, turning ordinary moments into creative inspiration. Customers occasionally noticed and smiled, charmed by the faint tunes that followed her through the cafe, though few realized the depth of talent behind them. Her recordings had begun to circulate locally, shared by friends, community members, and a few listeners who stumbled across her work online. The responses surprised her. People wrote messages of encouragement, telling her how much the melodies had touched them, how they made them feel hope, joy, and a connection that transcended distance. Each message reinforced what she had begun to believe, that her music could matter, that it could reach beyond herself and touch others in ways she had never imagined. Encouraged, she began thinking about performing in front of larger audiences. A local community center announced an arts festival, inviting musicians, poets, and performers to share their talents. She hesitated at first, feeling the familiar surge of nervousness and fear. What if the crowd didn't respond? What if she made a mistake? But she remembered the applause from the smaller showcase, the messages from listeners, and the way her own heart had lifted whenever she played. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was moving forward despite it. On the day of the festival, she arrived early, carrying her keyboard and notebook. Backstage, she watched other performers prepare, some tuning instruments, some practicing quietly. She noticed a mixture of excitement and anxiety in their expressions, mirroring her own. When it was her turn, she stepped onto the stage with steady breath and placed her keyboard in front of her. The audience was larger than she had ever faced, but she felt a strange calm. She opened her notebook, placed her fingers on the keys, and let the first notes flow. The melody rose softly, tender at first, then grew richer, fuller, and more confident. Each note carried the journey she had lived. Long hours of work, quiet nights of practice, the discouragement and doubt she had faced, and the determination that had carried her forward. Her fingers moved naturally over the keys, guided by intuition and passion. She played with heart, letting every emotion pour into the music. The audience leaned in, captivated, some closing their eyes, some swaying gently to the rhythm. It was as if the music bridged the gap between her world and theirs. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. People rose from their seats, clapping and cheering. She felt tears prick her eyes, not from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming realization that she had reached them. For the first time, she understood the power of sharing her gift openly. Her music wasn't just about self-expression. It was about connection, about letting others feel what she felt, about creating moments of shared humanity. People approached her afterward, praising the emotion, originality, and depth of her tunes. The words of encouragement, the smiles, and the acknowledgement were unlike anything she had experienced before. After the festival, she received an invitation to perform at a local cafe that hosted live music nights. It was a small venue, intimate and welcoming, but it represented a step forward, a chance to perform regularly and share her music more widely. She accepted, thrilled and nervous, understanding that each performance was both an opportunity and a challenge. Preparing for these gigs, she refined her melodies, experimented with harmonies, and practiced performing under the pressure of an audience. Each session strengthened her confidence, allowing her to relax and immerse herself fully in the music. In the following months, she became a fixture in the local music scene. Her performances were sought after, her recordings shared by more listeners, and her story inspiring to those who heard it. People admired her not only for her talent but for the courage and perseverance that had brought her from cleaning tables to performing on stage. She met other musicians, formed small collaborations, and discovered new ways to express herself through music. Each encounter, each note played, added layers to her artistry and reinforced the belief that she had found her calling. Her life had changed, but the essence of who she was remained. She still worked at the cafe, still cleaned tables and served coffee, but now she did so with a sense of balance, knowing that her music was an inseparable part of her identity. The world that had once told her to stick to cleaning had been transformed in her mind. She understood that people's expectations do not define one's potential, dedication, passion, and belief in oneself do. She no longer sought approval from those who doubted her. Instead, she sought to honor the music that had always lived inside her, to nurture it, and to share it authentically. The transformation she experienced was not just professional but personal. She became more self-assured, more willing to take risks, and more patient with herself. She realized that success wasn't only measured by applause or recognition but by growth, resilience, and the courage to continue despite challenges. Each note she played was a testament to her journey, every performance a declaration of her identity and spirit. She continued writing new tunes, exploring different styles, and experimenting with lyrics. The melodies in her notebook grew longer, more intricate, and more expressive. She began recording more regularly, sharing her creations online, and connecting with a broader audience. The feedback, though varied, was encouraging. Some listeners wrote about how her music inspired them to pursue their own dreams, while others simply expressed gratitude for the emotions her tunes had stirred. Each response reinforced the truth she had discovered. Music is a bridge, a language that can speak to anyone willing to listen. Her story began to spread quietly. Friends shared her journey, and local media took notice of the cleaner, turned musician who had defied expectations. She was invited to give interviews, sharing not only her music, but also the lessons she had learned about perseverance, courage, and believing in oneself. She spoke openly about the challenges she had faced, the doubts she had battled, and the small victories that had carried her forward. Her story resonated with many, serving as a reminder that talent and passion can emerge from unexpected places, and that no dream is too small to pursue. Despite growing recognition, she remained grounded. She understood the importance of humility and the value of her everyday life. Cleaning tables and performing on stage were not contradictory but complementary. One gave her stability, structure, and perspective. The other allowed her to express herself, inspire others, and grow. She embraced both with gratitude, finding balance and fulfillment in the intersection of ordinary work and extraordinary passion. Over time, she began mentoring other aspiring musicians in her community. She shared tips, encouraged them to trust their instincts, and reminded them that every journey begins with a single step. She emphasized that mistakes were not failures but lessons, and that persistence and courage were more valuable than immediate success. Through these interactions, she realized that her own journey could become a source of inspiration, and that supporting others added richness and meaning to her own experience. One evening, after a particularly successful performance at the local cafe, she returned home and reflected on her path. From the early days of secret humming, while cleaning, to performing on stage and recording her music, the journey had been filled with doubt, perseverance, and discovery. She recognized that the hardest moments had shaped her most profoundly, teaching resilience, patience, and the value of believing in oneself. Her music, once a hidden treasure, had become a force for connection, growth, and inspiration. Looking ahead, she knew there were still challenges and opportunities to face. The journey of a musician is never truly complete. There is always room to learn, create, and grow. But she felt ready, equipped with confidence, experience, and a deep love for her craft. The music inside her was no longer confined to her imagination. It had taken on a life of its own, reaching audiences, touching hearts, and affirming that dreams, no matter how improbable they may seem, can be realized through courage and persistence. She closed her notebook that night and placed her hands on her keyboard. The familiar rhythm, the rise and fall of notes, filled the small apartment with warmth and possibility. She hummed softly, a melody that carried the story of her journey, the struggles she had overcome, and the hope she held for the future. The world had once told her to stick to cleaning, to remain small and unnoticed, but she had proven that passion, courage, and dedication could transform life in ways she had never imagined. Her first tune had indeed proved them wrong, and it had opened the door to a future filled with music, inspiration, and endless possibility.